On an April morning in 1865, in a farmhouse parlor in Virginia, two men sat down to end the bloodiest war in American history. One of them wore a spotless new uniform and a sword of considerable value, sat 6 feet tall, and looked every inch the noble commander. That was Robert E. Lee. The other had ridden in wearing a mud-spattered private's coat with no sword at all, only the shoulder straps of his rank to show who he was. He was short, plain, and quiet, and 15 years earlier he had been such a complete failure that he was selling firewood on street corners and clerking in his father's leather shop. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, and he was there to accept Lee's surrender. This is the story of how the biggest failure in the room became the man who won the war, and then, in the single greatest moment of his life, refused to gloat. They called him a drunk. They called him a butcher. Both names stuck to him, and neither one is the whole truth. And the strangest part is what came after. The peace he tried to win would be thrown away, and he would spend his final months dying in agony, racing a pen against cancer to save his family from ruin. To understand the man in the shabby coat, you have to understand how far down he had been. Grant went to West Point without wanting to, fought bravely in the Mexican War while privately calling it a wicked one, and then stationed alone far from his wife and children in the 1850s, resigned from the army under a cloud of rumors that he drank too much. What followed were the worst years of his life. He tried farming a plot outside St. Louis and named it, with grim honesty, Hardscrabble. The farm failed. A business venture failed. He hauled firewood into the city and sold it in the streets. By 1860, at 38 years old, he was a clerk in his younger brother's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, a used-up man going nowhere. Then the war came and it turned everything upside down. Grant volunteered, was handed a regiment of unruly volunteers, and discovered that the very thing that had ruined him in peacetime, a stubborn, unglamorous refusal to quit, to panic, or to explain himself, was exactly what the Union armies had been missing. While other generals paraded and hesitated, Grant simply moved forward, and he did not stop. In February of 1862, at Fort Donelson in Tennessee, he cornered a Confederate army and won the North's first major victory of the war. The Confederate commander inside the fort, Simon Buckner, was an old friend from the army who had once lent Grant money when he was broke. Buckner sent out a note asking to discuss terms. Grant's written reply became famous overnight. "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." A whole country desperate for good news seized on it. His initials were USE, and now they stood for unconditional surrender. Ulysses S. Grant had a name at last, but a reputation cuts both ways. 2 months later, at a place in Tennessee called Shiloh, near a little log church, the Confederates attacked Grant's army at dawn before it was ready. The first day was a catastrophe. His men were driven back nearly to the river. That rainy night, his friend General Sherman found him standing under a tree, hat down against the storm, and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day." Grant answered, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And the next day he did. But when the smoke cleared, more than 20,000 men had fallen in 2 days, more casualties than all of America's earlier wars combined. The nation was horrified, and the old whispers came roaring back. "He's a drunk, he's a butcher, remove him." Pressed to fire Grant, Abraham Lincoln refused, with a sentence that outlived them both. "I can't spare this man, he fights." Lincoln kept him, and Grant went and did the impossible. The war's greatest prize was Vicksburg, a fortress city on high bluffs that controlled the Mississippi River and held the Confederacy together. General after general had failed to take it. So in 1863, Grant did something reckless enough to look insane. He cut his army loose from its own supply line, marched it deep into enemy country to live off the land, won 5 battles in less than 3 weeks, and drove the Confederate army under General Pemberton back inside the city walls. Then he simply closed his fist. The siege of Vicksburg lasted 47 days. The soldiers and the trapped civilians dug caves into the hillsides to survive the endless bombardment. Their food ran out, and they ate the mules, and then the dogs, and finally the rats. On the 4th of July, 1863, Pemberton surrendered the city and some 30,000 men. That very same week, far to the east, Robert E. Lee was being turned back at Gettysburg. In a matter of days, the Confederacy had been cut in two and dealt a wound it would never recover from, and the failed clerk from Galena had won the decisive campaign of the entire war. Now Lincoln gave him command of everything, making him the first man since George Washington to hold the full rank of lieutenant general. In the spring of 1864, Grant went east to do what no one else had managed, to beat Robert E. Lee, and he chose the most terrible strategy of the war. Not a clever battle, but a grip, a relentless grinding hold that would never let go. Through the tangled forest of the wilderness at Spotsylvania and at Cold Harbor, the fighting was so savage that at times thousands of men fell in a single hour. The newspapers screamed the word again, butcher. But Grant had done the arithmetic that no one else wanted to say out loud. Every man he lost could be replaced. Every man Lee lost could not. And so, for the first time, a Union commander who was hurt by Lee did not turn around and retreat. He pressed forward again and again and forced Lee back into the trenches around Petersburg. There the grip held for 9 brutal months, tightening until at last Lee's starving, shrinking army broke out and ran west with nothing left. It ended at a village called Appomattox Court House. Cornered, out of food, out of room, Lee asked for terms. And Grant, sick that morning with a blinding headache, dressed in that private's mud-spattered coat because he had ridden ahead of his baggage, sat down across from the immaculate Lee and wrote out terms that astonished everyone who heard them. The Confederate soldiers would stack their weapons and simply go home. Officers could keep their sidearms and their horses. There would be no prisons, no trials for treason, no parade of the humiliated. When Lee read the part about the horses and sidearms, he said with feeling that it would have a happy effect upon his army. Grant went further still. He let the ordinary soldiers keep their horses too so they could put in a spring crop and not starve. He sent 25,000 rations to feed Lee's hungry men, and when his own soldiers began firing cannon salutes to celebrate the victory, Grant ordered them to stop at once. The war was over, he said, and the rebels were our countrymen again. In his memoirs, he confessed that at the supreme moment of his life, he felt no joy at all, but something closer to grief. Sad, he wrote, at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly, even though their cause was, he believed, one of the worst for which a people ever fought. And that is where the simple, satisfying story usually stops. But Grant's hardest war was the one that came after the shooting. As president, he fought, with real and often lonely courage, to protect the freedom and the votes of 4 million newly freed Black Americans, sending troops to break the first Ku Klux Klan. Yet his presidency was also fouled by corruption among the men he trusted, and when he left office, the country lost its will. Reconstruction was abandoned. The rights Grant had fought to secure were stripped away across the South and would not be restored for nearly 100 years. The mercy of Appomattox helped the white North and South forgive each other and left the very people the war had freed to the mercy of their former masters. Grant's own ending was its own quiet siege. A swindler wiped out his life savings, and almost at the same moment, doctors found the throat cancer that was killing him. Broke and in terrible pain, he sat down to do the only thing that might save his wife from poverty. He wrote the story of his life. Choking, dosed with painkillers, sometimes able only to whisper, he drove himself to finish the manuscript and completed it just days before he died. His memoirs became one of the finest ever written by an American, and they earned his family a fortune. The man who could never make $1 in peacetime saved the people he loved at the very end, with nothing but a pen and the truth. So we remember the 2 uniforms at Appomattox, the elegant loser and the shabby quiet winner, and we call it the end of the war. But the drunk they could not spare, the butcher who chose mercy, left behind a harder question than any battle. He won the war, and he handed his enemies back their dignity. The other war, the one to make that victory actually mean something for the people it had freed, he could not win, and for 100 years, neither could anyone else. What is a victory worth if the thing it was won for is quietly given away? Grant seems to have known the answer. Perhaps that is why the man who could not bring himself to rejoice at Appomattox spent his dying breath years later still telling the truth.